The sound of my body hitting the hardwood at Christmas dinner wasn't the worst part. It was the silence that followed. The thin, taut silence that stretched like a held breath across my grandmother's dining room, past the silverware, the cranberry sauce on my dress, all the way to the grandfather clock that measured every humiliating second. I remember the taste of gravy in my mouth, the sticky smear of sauce warming against my knee where I'd landed. I remember the moment Frank pushed me like I was a chair that needed repositioning, and the way his hand didn't look like a hand that had loved me for 10 years. It looked practiced, like someone who'd rehearsed surprise and had perfected indifference. I remember my mother's face, red and confused, and Brittany, smug at the head of the table, who did not move to help me, because this was the kind of performance she'd been trained to give. My name is Simona Cunningham. I started a career in compliance because I liked finding the seams, where systems frayed, where numbers betrayed stories. I learned how to read ledgers like other people read faces. That skill is the same one I used to unravel the man who decided he could redraw the map of my life at his convenience. Before we go any further, the full title of this video includes a cruel slur. I'm not going to repeat it here. What happened that night was an act of public humiliation, an explicit message that I did not belong. When I quote what he said, I will paraphrase or use the cleaner, accurate version. He told me the seat was for his real daughter. That phrase is the axis of this story. It was enough to break something inside me and to set in motion everything that followed. If this story lands with you, if you've ever been made small at the hands of family or someone you trusted, stay with me. Like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments the worst thing you've sat through at a family table. There will be time later for the legal and the technical, and for the way we rebuilt things. But right now, sit with this moment with me. How Frank arrived is the kind of slow-motion takeover you only see in domestic dramas, but it plays out in real life all the time. A man shows up immediately after loss. He's helpful. He pays bills. He fixes things. And gratitude behaves like an anesthetic. My father had been gone a year when Frank started bringing casseroles. He quoted my dad's favorite jokes perfectly. He put his arm around my mother in the grocery store. He offered to handle the bookkeeping for my family's small architecture firm so things wouldn't be so hard. At first, his attention felt like a lifeline. We were a house of mourners. Our grief was a draft that pulled at the curtains. Frank stepped into rooms with solutions in his pockets. He handled contractors, smoothed supplier invoices, and spoke to our lawyers in the low, competent voice that makes you stop worrying. My mother, still raw and lonely, fell into that voice like a patient into a warm bath. My grandmother doted on him because he laughed at the right parts of old stories. Brittany, it sounds ugly to say, but it's honest, fell in line because Frank gave her things. Not huge things at first. A smartphone when she needed it, a winter coat that fit perfectly. Small gifts are bricks in the construction of loyalty. You learn to live with the small discrepancies. You tell yourself accounting errors happen. You accept the late tuition check the first time. But patterns reveal themselves like hairline cracks in plaster. The car we were supposed to use disappeared from the family registry and re-emerged in Brittany's name. Tuition funds started arriving in partial sums. My mother's trust account, the one Dad had set up to fund his legacy projects, showed odd transfers. Small ones at first, then bigger, then routed through shell company names I didn't recognize. I noticed because that was my job. I knew how to read the little breadcrumbs people leave when they think no one is watching. There were other, subtler things. Frank's jokes about real children began as teasing and then hardened into a recurring motif. He'd say, as a laugh, "You know, his real kids are the ones who," and everyone would fake laugh to keep the peace. But when teasing edges toward repetition with a target, it stops being a joke. It becomes a claim. The business, which had been my father's legacy, a modest practice that did clean residential and boutique commercial work, slowly shifted. Contractors who had worked with Dad for decades found their checks delayed. Vendors asked for upfront payments. Somewhere along the line, a second set of books appeared, the kind that gets opened only when the official one needs to reflect a different story. Frank's name began to appear on paperwork where my father's had been. He'd seat himself at negotiations and call the shots. When I pushed back, he smiled and said, "I'm just trying to protect us." That was the line he used a lot, protection. It's a comfortable blanket to lay over control. Protection justified everything from changing access passwords to moving property titles. It justified loans to people who were coincidentally connected to Brittany. It justified keeping my access to certain bank statements for my own good. When you are in a family dynamic in which the caretaker becomes the manager of everything important, it's easy for grief and trust to give way to authority. People deflect anger with gratitude. They tell themselves that the stranger who walked into the house was actually a savior. By the time Christmas rolled around that year, the pattern had been in place for nearly a decade. For 10 years, I watched a slow siphoning of resources and attention toward a single point: Brittany. She needed bailouts when she made poor choices. She needed credit when she lived beyond her means.
She was privately handed the things a family gives when it chooses a favorite. I watched the structure of our household bend to make room for her, and when I protested, I was minimized. "You're being dramatic," Frank would say. "You're taking things personally." Gaslighting is a clever tool. It's soft, and it smells like concern. On the evening of December 24th, the house looked the way holiday houses are supposed to look: garlands, a small tree in the corner, candles in the windows, my grandmother's china set laid out like a memorial to decency. My grandmother had insisted on doing the ham. She wore the pin that had belonged to my father. Everything familiar, except Frank, who had shown up in an extra schemed way. A new suit, a confidence like an operatic curtain rise. He sat at the head of the table, which, in a family accustomed to tradition, is a tiny throne. Seating at our table had always carried embedded meaning. The head seat was my father's. After he died, it was empty for a while. Then my mother would sit there. Then my grandmother, like a relay of caretakers. If you wanted to make a statement, you moved the chair. Frank moved the chair. He called it restoring order. He gestured like a man assigning roles. "We'll sit like this. It feels better." Brittany got the spot next to him, directly in the line of sight of the portrait of my father. I noticed the way she angled her body toward him, the way she never quite made eye contact with me in full. Dinner became a performance. Candles flared. There was the ritual of the blessing. My mother started, voice uneven. And then the offering of platters. I could feel tension in the way someone holds a knife too long. There had been little jabs all evening, tossed to test waters. Frank made a cracking joke about budgets in front of contractors who were there as guests. A cousin tried to change the subject and was handed, like a baton, a story that suited Frank. And then, as the ham was carved and the mood hovered between the awkward and the festive, Frank leaned back, put his hand on my shoulder in a movement that would, to anyone else, have read as tender, and pushed. Not a shove that would break a bone, no cinematic violence, but a push worthy of someone telling you your boundaries are imaginary. It was the physical manifestation of everything he'd been saying before. I stumbled. My hip hit the chair leg and then the floor. There was the sudden slap of the napkin as it escaped my hands, the warm smear of cranberry sauce on my lap like an exclamation point. No one lunged to help. My mother froze, her mouth a question mark. My grandmother's eyes were wet. Brittany's expression was a practiced canvas of indifference, a look that said, "This is what family looks like when you're chosen." Frank's face was a masterclass in performance. Mock surprise, then the casual line about that seat being for his real daughter, which he delivered with a finality designed to land. He didn't use the slur the headline shows. He didn't need to. The message landed all the same. The room recalibrated around that push. Conversations evaporated. My uncle coughed and then decided he had some important thing to attend to in the kitchen. A cousin fumbled with her phone. That silence wrapped around me like cold glass. I remember the granular sound of someone clearing their throat and the creak of the hardwood as the grandfather clock moved its hands. Someone told themselves a joke. Someone else refused to look at me. I got up by myself. It wasn't theatrical, it was automatic. People had to see me upright so the evening could continue. The music resumed, the next course came out as if nothing had cracked. But things didn't go back to how they were. We were all carrying a newly placed object in our pockets. An accusation, a truth, a humiliation. The rest of the night was a string of small wounds, micro-exclusions, quiet jokes at my expense. Doors closed a little too quickly. I slept poorly that night, not from pain, but from the ache of being made publicly less. That push crystallized a decade of behavior into a single readable moment. When an action includes your body and the witness of family, It becomes legal and emotional documentation at the same time. The problem after that night wasn't just pride, it was practicality. A humiliating shove cannot be reversed, but it can be recorded. It can be turned into evidence of a pattern. I had the skills to do that. I didn't yet have the evidence, but I had a plan. The next morning, my grandmother called me into the sunroom, where the light came across the old sofa in a way that made dust look like snow. She had a small envelope in her hand and a look that said she'd been guarding something for years. She told me in a voice that trembled that my father had left certain things with her for safekeeping. Among them was an old laptop and a tiny USB drive, the kind you forget about until you need it. She'd found them while cleaning a box in the attic and didn't know what to do with them. "I thought you should have them," she said, as if I were the only person who'd know what they meant. The laptop, when I opened it, smelled faintly of tobacco and stale coffee, Dad's habit, and the desktop was organized in a way that made my chest ache. Blueprints named in his handwriting, invoices labeled in neat terms. But there was another folder, hidden in plain sight, called Will Drafts. The files had dates that predated my father's death. There were scanned letters, notes about distributions, and a contract that referenced a trust set up to preserve the family's home and the practice as a legacy, to be managed for the next of kin. I don't want to romanticize that moment. Discovery is mundane. You click, you scroll, you sink into a chair and realize your breath has happened without you. But the files were like the push reframed.
They turned the intangible feeling I'd had for years into a concrete list of allocations. Who should have what, how assets were to be managed. My father's initials were on it. It said, in black and white, things that contradicted the narrative Frank had been building. There were distributions that should have gone into the trust and not into external accounts. There were instructions to maintain the firm as a legacy with defined beneficiaries, and the names were clear. None of this matched the new paperwork I'd been seeing in recent years. The USB contained even more: scanned bank reconciliations, a ledger exported to a CSV that showed transfers to companies I hadn't heard of and that didn't return calls. There were notes, hand-typed, about loans meant to support continuing education, not to become bailouts for a grown adult. The USB carried a faint imprint of someone else's life, emails saved to the drive, copies of internal communication, and a spreadsheet labeled Brittany Accounts, with columns that made no sense until you read the numbers. Do not mistake what I did next for heroics. It wasn't dramatic, it was methodical. I am by trade the person who notices anomalies. You don't jump to conclusions, you collect. I made copies, I created a secured folder on an encrypted drive, I took screenshots of timestamps, I wrote down file hashes and dates, small details that in court help establish that a file is original and has not been altered. For someone in compliance, chain of custody is a matter of habit. Keep the original media safe, work off copies, log who sees what. At night, I sat at my father's old kitchen table with a mug of coffee gone cold and mapped the money flows on butcher paper. Offshore transfers were indicated by bank codes. There were shell entities with names that read like corporate euphemisms. I drew lines from the trust account to these entities, and then from those entities to a series of transfers to personal accounts, some to a card registered to Brittany, some to accounts that looped through places I didn't recognize. I wasn't a prosecutor yet. I was a woman making sense of a liar's paper trail. There were ethical considerations. Some people would say I should have confronted Frank immediately. Others would say I should have gone to the police. I did neither at first because I knew how these things behaved. Confrontations can encourage cover-up. Police without material evidence often do little more than take a report. The pattern I'm describing had been active for years. It would take more than a single argument to invert it. It needed documentation, witnesses, a strategy that would hold up under scrutiny. That is the kind of thinking people pay consultants for. I didn't plan to be paid for it. I planned to be precise. One evening, after compiling enough to feel like enough, I scheduled something that felt as small and as revolutionary as a faucet turned on, an email cascade at 3 a.m.
I wrote to 3 recipients I knew would not sleep through the drip of evidence: our external counsel, a trusted vendor who had been affected by delayed payments, and a former business partner who had oversight of certain accounts. I attached the key files: screenshots, ledgers, the will draft, the USB's export, and in the body I wrote a plain list: what had been found, what I suspected, and a request to preserve records pending legal review. I kept the tone factual and the ask conservative: preserve, do not delete, and await counsel. Scheduling an email at 3 a.m. is theater as well as strategy. When you send at a time when everyone else is sleeping,
When your message hits inboxes at dawn, it interrupts. It gives you, briefly, the clarity of being the first to say a hard truth in a marketplace that prefers soft lies. I pressed schedule, and then I set a second one, to our mother, who I knew would wake early and need to see the words in a gentle frame, and a third to a journalist contact who had written gently about family businesses in the past. Not one of those steps was taken to shame. They were taken to create a record that could not be gaslit away. I slept poorly the night before the emails were due to go. My mind was a carousel of what-ifs. What if they call me crazy? What if this opens a battle I cannot win? What if the family implodes in a way that leaves no comfortable place for anyone? I told myself it was better to have messy truth than tidy betrayal. Messes can be cleaned. Betrayal calcifies. At 2:58 a.m., my phone buzzed with the vibration I recognized as a calendar reminder. The world felt smaller at that hour, less noisy. I felt like an archer about to release an arrow that would either hit its mark or get lost. I hit send. Morning arrived with the sound of my mother's phone ringing. I thought the noise would be louder, like an avalanche. It was instead a precise, focused clamor. Our lawyer called. A vendor texted a single line, "We need to talk." Someone from accounting sent me a screenshot with a timestamp. Social media is a beast that wakes at first light. Before breakfast, there were messages, then calls, then a series of pings that made my heart race. The house had become a pressure cooker. Frank's world, which had been a carefully constructed set of props and plausible deniability, was rattling. He reacted the way men like him usually react, with a public front and a private scrambling. There were lawyer calls, there were text messages sent in capitals that tried to reframe things. My phone filled with threats thinly disguised as warnings about defamation. My employer got an anonymous call asserting that I'd acted improperly. It was a coordinated attempt to cast doubt and to make the messenger the problem. That is also a predictable play in this kind of drama. Aim at the credibility of the one who speaks. Yet evidence has the boring power of gravity. It's heavy. It moves things. The receipts buckle under the pressure. Among the first reactions were practical. Someone at the firm froze certain transfers. A bank put a temporary hold on a suspicious wire. I received one email from a friend in accounting that read like a paragraph of calm in a storm. "Simona, keep copies. Don't delete anything. Get counsel." What followed then was the kind of public, personal attack that's designed to make you retract. Frank hired a reputation firm. There were glossy statements issued to friends and to a small local magazine that painted him as a protector. "Accusations are painful, but family comes first," one read, the kind of sentence that knows how to make guilt fold into itself. There were threats of lawsuits. There were denials that were elegant in their vagueness. But not everyone took the bait. Dorothy, the paralegal who worked with Frank's side on routine matters, had started to send me messages that read like breadcrumbs. She didn't say much at first, just a link and a time, and then more. Dorothy's messages were the kind of thing you don't expect in a battle like this, a voice on the inside that felt like a hand reaching under the table. She provided small confirmations that certain records existed, and that she had heard things that she wasn't comfortable letting stand. We met once in a public place. She was careful. Her cautiousness made me trust her. She didn't want drama. She wanted the truth to be recorded. That's where the tension lies in these situations. You can accumulate documents, but documents without corroboration are walls without doors. You can have a will draft, but you need people willing to say under oath that they encountered it, or you need metadata that shows files weren't manufactured. You need witnesses. You need people like Dorothy who will quietly say, "I saw this," even when that puts them at risk. And you need someone like Agent Chen, whose name I only knew later, to come in and add the kind of federal muscle that turns local disputes into charges that have teeth. At this point in the timeline, before federal attention and before arrests, it was still my little strategy against a big facade. I was the accountant who noticed the wrong ledger. I was the daughter who wouldn't be moved off a seat that had been denied to her by design. The early fallout was a squeeze. PR, legal posturing, and the constant domestic coldness, as family members took sides or pretended neutrality. Two things were true. One, Frank would fight back, and two, he couldn't hide forever if the paper trail was real. I remember the day Dorothy brought me a folder of voice recordings she had legally recorded in the course of her work, banal snippets that revealed more in their silence than frank admissions ever could. The recordings were messy. They were human. They contained the kind of offhand comments people make when they think no one is listening. Dorothy didn't want to be a villain. She wanted to be a witness. Her bravery, pragmatic and hushed, became a thread I could follow. By the time the week closed in, the family had reorganized itself into factions. My mother alternated between anger and denial. My grandmother, who had given me the USB, seemed on a slow incline toward clarity and away from the fog that grief leaves behind. Brittany, who had thrived in the sweet spot of Frank's attention, oscillated between loyalty and discomfort. There were moments when I thought I saw guilt in her face, and moments when that possibility dissolved into defensiveness. The cousins whispered. The lawyers sharpened their pencils. This is where I stopped being merely the injured party and started being a strategist. I stopped announcing plans and started executing them. It is one thing to be wronged. It is another to assemble wrongs into a case that others can understand and act upon. The compliance playbook is not glamorous. Preserve, document, notify, and then hold the line. It is a series of deliberate, sometimes tedious steps that, when done correctly, make obfuscation difficult. When the dust settled enough for me to get a clear breath, I sat down and made a list of everything Frank had touchpoints on: the business accounts, the trust, the mortgage on the house, the vendors who had been delayed, the employees who had complained. I mapped out the legal remedies and the civil options. Criminal charges would require proof of intent and the right kind of corroboration. Civil suits would be quicker but less dramatic. The path forward, I realized, would involve both an unspooling in public and patient work with counsel behind the scenes. So I called the people who could make the record matter: our lawyer, the vendor who had been moonlighting as a creditor, Dorothy, and a journalist I could trust to be careful. I bided my time as federal interest was only a rumor on the wind. Even then, the possibility of turning this into something that mattered beyond my family was both terrifying and exhilarating. If money had been siphoned and trust misused, then it wasn't only my dignity on the line, it was the legacy my father had tried to protect. When the calls started arriving that first week, they were the kind of calls that changed the trajectory of a life. There would be more of them. There would be threats. There would be countersuits. There would be late-night texts that tried to rattle me into silence. There would be the pushback of a man who had come to believe himself untouchable. But there would also be Dorothy's quiet messages, and the ledger lines that couldn't be explained as mistakes, and the way the USB glowed like a small lighthouse in the dark bowl of our living room. I ended that first week of the campaign with a single decision: to keep moving forward, to make the paper trail speak louder than the theater of family, and to treat every humiliating shove as a piece of evidence rather than a verdict.
The disease that had invaded our house, favoritism dressed as affection, theft disguised as protection, would take a long time to excise. But you start where you can, with facts, with witnesses, and with the audacity to send an email at 3 a.m. and watch the first domino fall. When you live through that initial shove, the rest of the story stretches ahead like a road with invisible potholes. You can choose to walk it slowly, to collect light and witnesses and legal counsel as you go, or you can sprint and risk tripping. I chose precision. I still had no idea how many people would turn out to be allies, how many would remain silent, or what price would be paid in reputation and in privacy. All I knew was that the chair at my grandmother's table that night had been moved for a reason, and I was no longer willing to pretend the rearrangement was harmless. The next sequence of events would escalate faster than the first decade had crept. Some people would stand with me, some would not, but the principle that had guided my work in compliance, evidence first, narrative second, would prove to be the crucial axis of what came after. I sat at that table again in the days following, this time not as someone waiting for permission, but as someone cataloging a case file in my head. Every look, every silence, every thinly veiled joke was a data point. There are moments when courage is small and almost invisible: the decision to save an email, the choice to copy a file, the phone call that begins a paper trail. There are moments when courage is loud: testifying in a deposition, standing before a room of family, or reading aloud a ledger that shows where money went. I was about to encounter both. I made one more call that week. It was to a woman who specialized in nonprofit formation. My idea, then still raw, was to create a mechanism for the firm's legacy to be preserved if we could wrest control back. It wasn't only about money, it was about stewardship. If the trust my father had envisioned could be activated, if the house and the business could be restored to their original mission, then there would be a way to convert this humiliation into a restoration that helped others avoid the same fate. I hung up, and for a moment I allowed myself to imagine a lunch a year from now where my mother would sit without fear, where my grandmother would bring the ham and brag on the way she always had, and where a child could take the seat at the table without fear of being displaced. Imagining is a small rebellion against the present. Then I turned my attention back to the practical: more copies, more safeguarded files, a schedule for depositions, a list of people to notify in the event of escalation.
I prepared for the war of attrition that follows exposure, knowing that the first 72 hours after a revelation are the most volatile.
I also understood that the fight would not be only legal, it would be public relations and human relationships and nights of second guessing. You can feel the air change right before everything goes loud. It's a quiet taste in your mouth, a tightening in your chest, like the seconds before a storm breaks. That was where I was standing, on the threshold between being pushed out and pushing back. The next move was no longer just mine. It involved Dorothy, the vendor, our counsel, and a slow incoming awareness that some patterns don't survive the light. I set my alarm for 2:40 a.m. and lay awake thinking of the grandfather clock. It had been witnessed once, it would witness again. I set my alarm for 2:40 a.m. and lay awake thinking of the grandfather clock. It ticked in the next room like a judge calibrating time. At 2:58, I hit send, and then the house became an echo chamber of possibilities. The first sign that things were worse than I'd imagined came not as a headline, but as a quiet, panicked voicemail from our external counsel. "We've received inquiries. Don't post anything. Lock your devices." His voice was low, the tone people use when they're trying to keep calm and failing. That was the sound of a screw turning in a machine that had finally noticed the grit in its gears. Within 24 hours, the office was a theater of urgency. Vendors I had known for years called and used words like embezzlement without asking permission. The local bank put a temporary freeze on several transfers at my request, and to my surprise, thanked me for coming forward. It felt strange to be thanked for pointing at the obvious. When wrongdoing is invisible long enough, honesty itself becomes an inconvenient interruption. Frank's first move was familiar theater, a glossy statement authored by his PR team, and a brief interview with a local magazine where he positioned himself as protector and stabilizer. Doug, the reputation consultant he hired, had the kind of smile that works in photographs and the talent for turning attack into sympathy. He sent well-crafted lines to friends, to local nonprofits we'd supported. "Accusations are messy," one memo read, "but family values are essential." The message was precise: discredit the messenger and redirect attention to tradition. Those early hours were crucial in ways that aren't glamorous. I did not spend them responding to every rumor. I spent them cataloging. Chain of custody was still my religion. I logged every call I received, timestamped every email with metadata, and made sure copies of every file existed in at least 3 secure locations. When you're building a case, small administrative discipline is the scaffolding of eventual justice. Dorothy's next message arrived like a lifeline. She'd been cautious from the start, but she sent a folder that changed the tenor of the entire thing.
The files were simple: recorded conversations, an email thread, internal notes, none of which on their own looked like the hammer we needed. Together, however, they began to look like a wrecking ball. One clip was a voicemail left on a billing line, a clipped voice joking about solving 2 problems with 1 transfer, and a laugh that didn't belong in the same sentence. Another was an offhand comment from a staff meeting where Frank, speaking about the girls, described a plan for credit adjustments. Dorothy's recordings were messy. People cleared their throats, sighed, used euphemisms. They were human, and that was their power. People who commit fraud rarely speak in legalese. They speak in convenience. Dorothy's folder let us hear the convenience. I turned Dorothy's sounds into a narrative. I annotated the audio, transcribed every slurred sentence, and linked phrases to bank entries. When someone on a tape said, "We'll move it through Gateway and then it's clean," I matched that phrase to a wire and to the shell company that had received an unexplained deposit. Seeing the line from phrase to payment was doing something that anger alone never could. It made a story outwardly legible to people who wouldn't accept a daughter's pain as proof. Word spread slowly, and then with the speed of a loose page in a wind tunnel. A journalist I had trusted, a woman who had written fair stories about family businesses, reached out cautiously and asked if I would be willing to speak. I said yes, but I set limits. My aim was never to perform trauma for clicks. My aim was to ensure that the pattern of wrongdoing became visible outside our house and inside institutions that could act. It was the journalist who first mentioned federal interest as a real possibility. "Have you spoken to anyone from the Special Crimes Unit?" she asked. I hadn't.
To me, federal meant big. It meant subpoenas and agents with badges and the kind of resources local offices don't have. The idea was both terrifying and oddly comforting. If this moved beyond family drama, there would be officials whose job it was to care about paperwork. I'd always joked that compliance is the language bad actors fear, the way a tax auditor's pen makes people sweat. The thought that someone else's pen might come down on the ledger made me breathe a fraction easier. Sure enough, over the next week, a plain car rolled up in front of my mother's house. The agent who stepped out, Agent Sarah Chen, was not the caricature you see on TV. She was mid-30s, wore her hair in a short, no-nonsense style, and had the kind of posture that suggested she'd had a long conversation with reality and lost the fight to sugarcoat it. She introduced herself quietly and asked for 2 hours of my time. We went through what Dorothy had given us, the USB material and the bank flows. She asked deliberate questions, the kind that map motive as much as method. There was no heroism, only patient cross-examination of facts.
When federal agents begin asking for records, the quality of what you've preserved matters more than the volume. The files I had hashed, the screenshots I'd timestamped, the copies stored in secure drives, all of it mattered. Agents like Chen don't hammer people with drama. They build cases by stacking details until only one conclusion remains plausible. I saw that in the way she nodded toward a CSV that traced a trail of funds to a shell entity and then to a personal account tied to a credit card used by Brittany. There's a strange alchemy in having an outsider validate your suspicion. It isn't about vindication in the petty sense. It's about converting shame into procedure. For years, I had been told I was too sensitive or too dramatic. When Agent Chen read a ledger and asked a banker a question and watched them go pale, the world tilted. It became no longer a matter of family politics. It became a line item on a federal inquiry. Frank didn't wait to be indicted. He prepared. Richard Steinberg, his lawyer, sent a letter that was both precise and menacing. Any public statements must cease, it read. There were threats of litigation and subtle suggestions my employer might want to reconsider my public-facing role. Those parallel actions were, again, predictable. When someone's house of cards looks wobbly, they try to intimidate witnesses into silence. It's an ancient play, and it nearly always works on the timid. There were moments when the intimidation landed. My employer placed me on administrative leave pending an internal review. The anxiety of watching my career hang in bureaucratic balance almost undid me. It's one thing to lose sleep over legal strategy. It's another to worry about whether you will still have a paycheck. I thought often about the many women who are silenced not by law or by evidence, but by the simple arithmetic of survival. Bills that must be paid, children to consider. In those quiet hours, I understood how pernicious the small levers of control can be. But the case gained gravity with Dorothy's continued bravery, and a string of witness statements that arrived like thread to a loom. One by one, people I had assumed would stay quiet began to speak, not for me personally, but for truth. Vendors sent affidavits about delayed checks. An accountant from a bank documented the odd routing of client funds. A former employee confirmed the existence of a secondary ledger system. These were not dramatic revelations. They were a chorus of small confirmations that, when sung together, formed a very disturbing melody. Brittany's role in all this was complicated in ways I had not anticipated. She was, for years, simply the favored child, an effect of a system that seeks easiest paths and rewards loyalty. But as the evidence mounted, Brittany's defenses began to falter. She left voicemails that, in hindsight, look like the sound of someone shifting position because the furniture under them is hot. In a meeting arranged by our lawyer, she finally admitted that she had accepted funds, sometimes saying she thought they were loans, sometimes claiming she had been told the money came from a different source. What mattered legally was that she provided recorded statements and messages that corroborated certain transactions. She was not the architect of the scheme, Frank was, but she was a vessel through which the funds flowed. The human complexity of that is messy. It involves dependence, denial, and the occasional sliver of conscience. I remember the day Agent Chen leaned back after watching a clip of Dorothy's recordings and said simply, "We can bring this to a grand jury." The words felt both sudden and inevitable. The grand jury is a blunt instrument of consequence. It doesn't determine guilt in the way a jury trial does, but it decides whether the facts are sufficient to charge. When Chen said it, she meant that the case had moved beyond family contortions and into formal judicial machinery. We kept moving like careful carpenters. Depositions were scheduled, subpoenas went out. I testified in a deposition where my voice shook in places I didn't expect, where I had to describe, in legal terms, the feeling of being sidelined at a dinner table, and then tether that description to documents. Testifying is a strange ritual. You tell the truth, but you also armor it for cross-examination. You learn which pieces of your life are going to be examined and which will be left untouched. For me, it was a lesson in resilience rather than discovery. I'd curated the evidence not because I wanted to hurt people, but because I wanted to prevent this from happening to anyone else. Then came the dawn raid, the kind of thing you only see in dramatized clips that never quite capture the thudding reality of boots on stairs. Federal agents arrived with warrants and with the quiet authority of someone who has spent nights aligning facts. They executed searches on business offices and a few personal properties, collecting servers, hard drives, and paper files. Watching them move through a place that had been our home felt like watching an autopsy being performed on a life that had once seemed solid. I stood in the doorway as they lifted a box with our firm's logo and went through it like physicians examining a patient. It was clinical and necessary, and for reasons I couldn't entirely parse, oddly cleansing. News spread. There were arrests. Not everyone went in the first wave, but the ones who did were significant. When the news announced the name of the person taken into custody, my stomach turned in a way that I hadn't expected. The cameras filmed from a respectful distance. Local news is always careful not to sensationalize for the wrong kind of reasons, and the reporters read prepared statements. It was a strange mix of privacy and publicness. Words were allowed out of our mouths, but behind a curtain of legal phrasing. Public reaction was a wild thing.
There were those who supported me openly, and those who criticized my decision to go public. Some old friends dropped away. Social media offered both a strange sanctuary, supportive messages from strangers who had experienced their own small humiliations, and a toxic feed of commentary from people who assumed they knew the whole story from a headline. That is the cost of holding truth in public. You surrender the option of privacy, but gain the possibility of accountability. Courtroom proceedings, when they arrived, were procedural and human in equal measure. There was the ritual of arraignment, the reading of charges, and then the slow drum roll of discovery. My role in the courtroom was not as a star, it was as a witness and a steward of documents. When I testified in court, I read aloud ledger entries and email threads, and watched the jurors' faces as if I were reading them a map. The prosecution's job was to connect motive to method. The defense's job was to inject doubt. That is how criminal cases are structured, and it is why patience and detail often win when drama fails. One pivotal moment came when Dorothy's recordings were admitted into evidence and played in court. In the small theater of a federal courtroom, a place where every cough is measured, those clips landed like stones. People whose voices once carried authority in the house of the family sounded different when replayed in a neutral room, small, casual, not fully realizing their words would be nobody's private property anymore. For jurors and for the public, the recordings shifted a narrative from he said, she said into a pattern. The legal system, for all its drama, is also slow. While the criminal side moved forward, a parallel civil avenue was unfolding. We sought to activate the trust my father had set up, to secure assets, and to prevent further dissipation of funds. That involved trust courts and trustees, and a complex activation that required proof of wrongdoing and an account of how the trust had been circumvented. There were hearings where we argued that the trust's instruments had been tampered with, or that distributions had been improperly authorized. I sat through these proceedings with a fatigue that is different than sleepiness. It is the fatigue of someone watching their life be examined and sometimes misread. There was a feature in the proceedings that felt, in its way, like a small miracle, an emergency asset freeze. The court, persuaded by the presentation of bank flows and by the seriousness of the federal inquiry, issued a freeze on certain accounts tied to the shell companies. That freeze prevented money from being siphoned further and gave us breathing room to sort through the mess. It was a legal lever that translated into practical protection. Invoices were paid, vendors were alerted, and the small firm's projects could continue with the immediate threat of collapse. Amid the legal grind, smaller human reckonings took place.
My mother, who for a long time had wavered between loyalty and suspicion, sat across from me one afternoon and said things she hadn't been able to say in public, apologies that were both private and necessary. She told me she had been lonely after Dad's death and had leaned on Frank in ways that, in retrospect, made her vulnerable to manipulation. Her voice faltered when she said she wished she'd seen more earlier. That moment was not cinematic. It was ordinary. Hands in tea, a window that fogged with winter, a sincerity that made us both cry. For me, it was an important seam in the process of reunion.
Justice is not just addressed through courts, it is also made in small domestic reconciliations. There were surprises, too, not of the legal variety, but of human complexity. Brittany was not simply a villain. She arrived in court one day and sat in the audience, her presence a study in discomfort. At one point, she called me and said she wanted to talk. We met in a neutral cafe where they served strong coffee in chipped cups. She apologized, not for the things she could not fully control, but for the ways she had been complicit, taking money she thought was a loan, failing to ask uncomfortable questions. Her remorse was complicated and self-protective and real. We did not become friends overnight, but the conversation was part of a slow unraveling of what had been built on convenience and silence. The federal case moved toward resolution with a string of decisions that, for a long time, I had only allowed myself to whisper about at night. There were guilty pleas. Some people accepted accountability. For others, their culpability was sorted in the slow, unavoidable arithmetic of evidence. Sentencing followed. I will not dramatize the courtroom. There are legal reasons and ethical reasons to describe such moments with restraint. But I will say this: the sentencing day was not triumphal. It was a procedural recognition that certain choices had caused measurable harm. There were tears, mine among them, but also a quiet sense that the scales had, to whatever small degree, been nudged toward balance. After the dust settled on the criminal side, the civil mechanisms kicked in with renewed force. The trust that my father had written about, the one whose draft I found on his old laptop, was activated. That meant, practically, that the house and the firm could be restored to their intended purpose. It meant trustees had been appointed, who were carefully vetted and who understood the mission Dad had envisioned. To keep the practice small, to take on projects that honored craftsmanship over profit, and to create a modest fund to support young architects in need. When the mechanism clicked into place, a bank transfer, a signed document, a court order, I felt relief like the loosened knot of a rope. The restoration process also involved financial restitution.
Assets that had been frozen were evaluated, some were returned, and others were subject to civil recovery suits. There were auctions, negotiated settlements, and judgments. The math of justice is rarely neat, and no one emerged untouched. But the firm's projects could continue. Employees kept their jobs. The house, which had been a site of such intimate public drama, became once again a place where we could host people without the oppressive sense that everything was contingent on a whispered instruction. I want to be clear about something that surprised me. Justice is not the same thing as vengeance. Watching Frank face consequences, to the point of accepting a sentence that removed his liberty for a time, did not make me gloat. It was a relief, professional in its core, that the system had worked as a mechanism to prevent further harm. The satisfaction was less personal and more structural. The firm had been protected, my father's legacy had been preserved, other potential victims had been spared. That is what restoration feels like when it is done in good faith. In the wake of conviction and restitution, we focused on rebuilding not just assets but trust. Part of that work took the form of institutionalizing lessons. I sat with Mitchell Reeves, an attorney who would later become a partner in our family's post-litigation governance, and eventually my mother's partner in the more mundane but vital matter of estate oversight. He was practical and clear-eyed, and had a knack for translating legalese into human language. Together we drafted new governance structures for the firm, independent oversight committees, mandatory audits, and clearer guidelines for conflict of interest. Those measures weren't about punishment, they were about prevention. I also did something that felt both therapeutic and practical. I launched a nonprofit, the Simona Foundation, focused on helping families recover from financial elder abuse and predatory family schemes. It was a small thing at first, a website, a hotline, a network of vetted legal clinics that offered sliding scale services. Over time, the foundation grew into a modest community resource that helped others navigate the messy intersection of family and finance. Creating the foundation felt like taking the broken pieces of my family's story and offering them as a map for others. It was inventive and useful, and it kept me grounded. Chad, the documentarian who had started filming narratively neutral footage early on, produced a short piece that aimed to be less about spectacle and more about systems. He interviewed Ventas who had been affected, a couple of family members who had found their voices, and a few of us who had worked on the case. He was careful with his framing and refused to turn pain into a product. The film was not viral, and that was part of its virtue. It reached people who needed to see that this sort of thing happens and that steps exist to fight it.
That kind of measured storytelling matters. There were other small gestures of restitution that meant more than any headline. My grandmother, who had been the one to hand me the USB, gave a toast at a family dinner in which she looked at each of us and, without naming names, said, There are people who come through our door who make themselves at home, and we let them, but the house is ours. The room was quiet and full, and in that quiet, I felt a kind of closure that no sentence could have offered. She had been brave in a domestic way long before the FBI got involved. She kept artifacts safe until someone was ready to read them. I visited Frank once after his conviction, in a place where our country's punitive instincts are made manifest behind razor wire and fluorescent light. I didn't go to gloat. I went because it felt necessary to see justice as the end of a chapter rather than the start of something permanent. We didn't speak for long. He offered a version of an apology that carried some contrition and a lot of evasion. I listened, then left. The visit allowed me to close a literal door on a chapter and to turn my focus toward the practical, the business, the foundation, and the complex emotional repair. People often ask what I would tell someone who sees a similar pattern in their life. My answer is simple and procedural, not heroic. Document. Get counsel. Protect the records. Tell someone you trust. There is nothing poetic about bureaucracy, but layer upon layer of small decisions, saving an email, hashing a file, setting an alarm, add up into reverence for reality. Those choices make the difference between being gaslit into silence and being able to point, with documentation, at the pattern of betrayal. There was a moment, months after the sentencing, that made this entire ordeal feel real in the sweetest possible way. We hosted a small holiday dinner, but it was different. People decided seats together. My mother asked if I would take Dad's old spot. I hesitated for a beat, not because of fear, but because of the gravity of the gesture. When I sat down, my grandmother's eyes lit up. The table felt ordinary in all the right ways. The ham was slightly overcooked. Someone forgot a vegetable, and we laughed at the same joke Dad used to tell. There wasn't fanfare. There didn't need to be. It was proof that restoration can be ordinary. The foundation continued to do the work I had hoped for: legal clinics, educational seminars for trustees, and a hotline that offered referrals to vetted attorneys. We published guides on how to spot financial manipulation and how to preserve evidence. People wrote to me from many states, telling their stories. Some were small and terrible. An aunt coerced into signing documents. A neighbor who had watched a trust be drained. Others were more dramatic. Each letter mattered. Each one reminded me why I had endured the long nights and the nasty deadlines.
There is, I think, a temptation to write these kinds of stories as tidy narratives, where villainy is wrapped up and heroes wear clean clothes. Real life is messier. People I loved had made bad choices for complicated reasons. Some people who had hurt me had their own histories of damage and survival. That doesn't excuse harm, but it complicates the human landscape. It also made me determined to build institutions that could help people who were vulnerable to similar predatory patterns. If there is a single image that I keep returning to as a kind of compass, it is not the shove, but the USB in my grandmother's warded hand. The way she trusted me with something she didn't understand, but instinctively knew was important. That small act of trust turned humiliation into accountability. It reminded me that sometimes the smallest, most domestic gestures are the ones that change trajectories. I have learned that justice has multiple faces. There is punitive justice, accountability in a courtroom for actions that break laws. There is restorative justice, the slow, patient work of rebuilding trust in structures. And there is communal justice, the way a neighborhood or a profession or a family chooses to remember what happened and adapt. In my case, we pursued all three where appropriate. The result has been imperfect, which is exactly what real restoration looks like. I do not want to leave you with the impression that a happy ending erases the trauma. The push at the Christmas table left a scar that I carry in my back when I sit too long, and in a flinch when someone moves my chair without asking. But the scar is also a map of survival. It says where I broke and where I healed. It tells a story of how paperwork and patience and small acts of courage can change the course of a life. If you're watching this and you've ever been made small at a family table, if someone has ever rearranged your place and told the room you don't belong, know this: humiliation does not have to be the final sentence of your story. Small acts accumulate. Documentation is a form of resistance. Seeking counsel is not betrayal, it's survival. And telling your story, whether to a trusted friend, to counsel, or to a community resource, is sometimes the first step toward getting the world to pay attention. Before I go, a practical note. I've linked resources in the description below.
legal clinics that take on elder and familial financial abuse, and the Simona Foundation's hotline that can point you to vetted counsel and support networks. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing for more behind-the-scenes looks at how ordinary people can use ordinary tools, files, timelines, witness statements, to hold power accountable. And if you have a worst family dinner story, tell it in the comments. We're building a community here where the small cruelties that once made us silent become testimonies, and eventually data that helps protect others.
I don't want to end on a note of triumph. I want to end on a note of continued work. We are still fixing things: trust provisions, governance clauses, and the foundation's programs. The work is ongoing, and I expect it will be for a long time. I have a file drawer now with new policies and a list of vendors who will never again be allowed to operate in the margins. I have a family that speaks more, a mother who asks hard questions and listens, and a grandmother who no longer worries that the house isn't what it should be. If anything, the story I've told is a small argument for the power of paperwork and perseverance. When someone whispers that this is just how family works, paperwork says otherwise, and so does the law. Both are imperfect, but both can be marshaled for good. Thank you for staying with me through this longer piece. If anything I've said helps even one person take the small but necessary steps to protect themselves, then it was worth telling. Subscribe for updates on the Foundation's work and for more stories like this. If you are in immediate danger or suspect financial abuse in your household, please reach out to the resources linked below. We moved the chair back to where it belonged, not because a court ordered us to, but because we decided, together, that the house would no longer be arranged for convenience. We decided, slowly and stubbornly, to honor the person who built what we had had to fight to keep. And that, more than any sentence, or freeze, or headline, is the restoration that matters to me.